Welcome to episode 64 of the Red Room podcast. In this episode, we are pleased to announce an interview with the author of the book Difficult Men, Mr. Brett Martin.
He covered a really interesting topic. He did the showrunners of The Sopranos, The Wire, Mad Men, Deadwood, Breaking Bad. There's a lot of other shows that are mentioned. It actually goes back, talks about Stephen Bochco, NYPD Blue, Hill Street Blues. He doesn't really focus on plot. He focuses more on the writer. And we found that interesting. He was gracious enough to give us an interview. We're going to play the interview for you, which runs about 30 minutes. Then we're going to come back and talk about the book. And we really suggest that you buy the book and enjoy the interview.
We have a quote that really struck us right off the bat, where you have a network television veteran told you this isn't like publishing some lunatic's novel or letting him direct a movie. It's handing a lunatic a division of General Motors. We found it fascinating that you chose to write about the story creators rather than the story themselves. So can you tell us about how you came up with that concept?
My interest from the very beginning was about the larger question of what happens to the artist in the commercial sphere. What happens when mostly men are in a position, especially with television, to work in a medium that when most of these guys were starting out was considered the garbage heap or the sellout heap. What happens when suddenly they're given the opportunity to do great art in that medium? It was a moment about halfway through the writing of it when I was really struggling and not knowing exactly what would happen. I had this realization that what I was writing was a book about writers, and that really snapped everything into focus for me.
And I think that's why we were drawn to the book, because to me, that is so much more interesting, how you bring us into these writers' rooms. And these men that were trying to bring something different to television, did you have issues with your publisher saying this isn't what somebody would want to read about? Did you have the same sort of struggles?
That's interesting you say that. Actually, I certainly had that fear going in, but Penguin Press was really terrific about that. There was always the danger a publisher would want more dirt, more gossip, more recapping of the shows. Something different is really the point. And they were very supportive. I had a couple of editors throughout the process, extremely supportive of how it turned out. So I can't complain. On the other hand, I've been in that position. I am primarily a magazine writer, and I'm familiar with trying to balance the needs of being a writer with the commercial imperative, with needing to fulfill what a magazine or a newspaper needs to do to fill their pages. So I've been in that position many times, and that's why this world attracted me so much.
I think that is an interesting thing about television. One of the things in your book is a line that says, the goal of a TV show is to never end. But obviously, a great story has an end, and the battle of television is art versus money, because obviously the network wants to go on forever, which we see today when Mad Men, they now say they're going to do 7 episodes and then wait another year and play the other 7. So I think that battle happens.
Absolutely. I think that's why it turned out that the perfect temperament and the perfect worldview for this good television is one you see particularly in Mad Men, and I think that's strongly inherited from David Chase and The Sopranos, a very grim way of viewing the way change happens, which is to say, not much at all. Having that natural view of the world, a kind of dim view of human change and progress, is what made David Chase sort of the great artist and the great pioneering artist of this kind of TV, because it allowed him to fulfill what the network wanted, which is to keep going and keep Tony's story going while staying artistically true. It's just one of the many battlegrounds between art and money that you find when you start delving into this. And it's really true. That's the tension. Movies have the same tension. Books have the same tension. There are very few art forms that can exist without, at some point, coming into conflict between a pure expression and the commercial demands. And frankly, that's the art that most people don't want to see. I would argue that those kind of compromises and that kind of tension is what makes great art. It's very rare that an artist doesn't do well with outside pressure of some sort. And the need to please an audience balanced with one's internal artist, it is a good film.
So while we're on David Chase, I think you write it in almost like a novelistic way, so I think anyone would enjoy it. You mentioned a show that I haven't thought about in years, and that's All Fly Away. My mom made me watch this show with her, and I thought it was the most boring show ever, and we're tracing all of this creativity back to the show. Now, did you ever actually see an episode of All Fly Away?
I did. I watched it. You know, what happened with it, it's actually an interesting precursor in more than one way. It reran on PBS. Honestly, I did like it. I don't know, I'm probably a little older than you, so maybe it was a matter of coming to it at a different stage. But Sam Waterston was terrific in it. It kind of showed that 10, 15 years later would have been a great HBO show. And at that time was struggling to balance its better angels with the problems of being on a network. But it was also a hugely important incubator of talent, both David Chase being the most prominent example, but Barbara Hall, who has done a lot of good work on television, came out of that. Henry Burmell, who recently died, but was another sort of major showrunner, was on that staff as well. And then, of course, a bunch of them went over to Northern Exposure, which was the more popular of those two shows. But I gotta say, I think if you revisited it, it would probably look dated now, but I don't know how boring you'd find it. Somebody said to me, if the worst show you're on is I'll Fly Away, you've had an incredibly good career. At its height, the writer's room of The Sopranos included people who had written for The New Adventures of Flipper, Xena Warrior Princess, The Incredible Hulk, Becker, obviously, of Bad Weiner. That's what a career in TV certainly was, and to some extent is now. The entire lineage of The Shield and now Sons of Anarchy comes out of Nash Bridges.
Wow. Let's move on to Deadwood, because I really loved this part. In the book, you say the cancellation of Deadwood is when HBO broke their trust with audiences, and I just loved that concept. Can you talk a little bit about what you talk about in the book as far as Deadwood getting axed?
As far as I know, it was really, in terms of the motives behind it, like many HBO shows that are critically acclaimed, it wasn't doing especially well numbers-wise. And it was an extremely expensive show to produce, and there were some complicated esoteric rights issues involving who actually owned the rights to it in the foreign market. Basically, the upshot was that it wasn't going to be the kind of moneymaker that the other shows were. And it came to a point where Chris Albrecht decided to cancel it. It was the first moment in the new HBO era at which any of those considerations appeared to have any weight at all. It had been both inside the building and outside the building. The impression had been that HBO was suddenly this kind of Garden of Eden where ratings didn't matter, and you could trust that if you invested in a show, you would be rewarded with a full, complete, and satisfying ending. And so I think it really shook a lot of confidence. There was a huge amount of infighting about whether it had been a good idea or not to cancel it. And I think that there was a basic breach of trust with the audience that, it's the Twin Peaks problem. I know you guys are Twin Peaks fans, or the Lost problem, which is in order to invest what these shows ask you to invest, you have to have this bedrock faith that you're in good hands, that you're being led by somebody who has a vision, that you're not being dicked around. And that includes by the network. And so I think that was a fairly significant moment, even if it didn't seem it at the time, and making HBO look like what it is, which is a network like any other that makes mistakes.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I watched Deadwood and it was live, and I was devastated when they canceled it. But in retrospect, and reading your book and all the stories you tell about David Milch, it was almost be like handing Charles Bukowski his own show back in the 70s. It doesn't surprise me.
You have to also remember, for whatever reason, David Milch has never finished a show. He's never done that. And maybe there are other stories out there about exactly how that went down and how much David Milch perhaps walked away. It's a bit of a tangle. And it wouldn't be, this is without any particular knowledge of this, it certainly wouldn't be off base to speculate that there's something about him that undermines putting himself in a position where he has to finish. I know he left NYPD Blue before it ended. Certainly Luck and John from Cincinnati weren't allowed the full run.
I had never heard the stories you had told about David Milch on NYPD Blue, and I'm curious is why didn't ABC fire him if NBC fired Aaron Sorkin for not staying on budget? And of course, The West Wing I think was probably more successful than NYPD Blue.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what went on in either boardroom. I know that NYPD Blue was hugely successful, and it ran on his madness. And he had created a situation for a long time that made that in which he was indispensable to that. And he had actually created a world in which he was the only one who could keep that train moving. And I think a handful of years between those two incidents were huge in determining the economics of what a network was like. So I don't know an exact answer, except that it made networks were a lot more vulnerable by the time of The West Wing than they had been just a few years earlier.
And the timeline in your book, by the way, the graphic when the shows was very illuminating. I don't think we've ever pictorialized it in our own heads like that, but it was really illuminating to see just those creative spurts and how shows fed off of each other. Great.
Yeah, thank you. I was happy about that. That started as my own reference while I was writing, because I constantly had to be checking what was going on contemporaneously with other shows. But I also thought that it really did illustrate this tiny little root of one or two shows, and then by the end, it's this enormous tree.
Right.
I'm glad that worked for you.
Cool. In the Rolling Stone this week, they have this final word on Breaking Bad, and they asked Vince Gilligan, is Walter White supposed to be an examination of what it means to be a man? And he said that in the beginning, he probably overdid the whole pathetic aspect of Walter White because he wanted viewers to sympathize with him. But the quote he said was that in hindsight, I've learned the audience will go along with a character so long as he is capable of handling his business. He says, what is it people like about Darth Vader? Is it that he's evil or that he's so good at his job? And as I look back at all the shows you chose to talk about, every one of those characters were really good at what they did. They weren't necessarily moral, but they were good at what they did.
I think he might have been even referencing a quote in the book, which is David Chase talking about what he learned from the Rockford Files, which is that you can have a hero be any, or a protagonist do any number of terrible things as long as he's the smartest man in the room and he's good at his job. So that's definitely something that I agree with. The truth is, it's been shocking over this generation to find the things we will forgive a hero. That's part of the point of my book. That we're so conditioned still, that reflex to root for whoever is the central character. And as long as they're well written too, is what I would say, outside of the kind of step outside of the fictional world. And it's an incredibly difficult bond to break.
And this is why I'm so happy that we're talking to you at this moment in time, because the epic episode of Breaking Bad just aired, where essentially the show is over and we're about to go into epilogue. And I would say that this show has successfully slammed the door on this third age of television that you talk about, which is really about men at work, what they do, what we're willing to follow them along with. And I think that this show finally broke that mold that you talked about, that we're always willing to go along with that central character.
I think you're right. I think you've certainly done more to expose that and to specifically make that the dynamic of the show, which all of these shows test you. Are you still in? You still like Tony? Still like Walt? And you're absolutely right. The last couple of weeks have just been so insanely devastating that it's very hard to imagine. And yet, there's a lot of chatter out there, still have people out there incredibly reluctant to completely write him off.
We didn't mention The Wire, and we love The Wire here. I feel like you really beat up on season 5 of The Wire. It's definitely the worst season, but that's because the other 4 are freaking spectacular.
It deserves to be measured. It would be an insult to David Simon to measure it against anything but the other 4 seasons. Yeah, sure. Compared to most television, yeah, it was great. Compared to most good television, it was great. But I do think it was a significantly worse season. And it became clear, talking to a lot of people involved with it, that the reason was that a lot of the people who had been so vital to the early, in collaborating to make those first 4 seasons so good, had checked out in one form or another. I have nothing but admiration for David Simon. I think he's a genius, which is his official title now. The Wire is a great work of literature. I think it should be watched by every American. I think it's an astonishing accomplishment. I also think that every one of his weaknesses was exposed by that final season. And I found it disappointing.
I think it was you who said this. Season 4 once you brought in those kids and you saw the kids' life, you were never going to top that season.
That's Nina Noble, who was the executive producer. I believe that's a quote from her. That's the challenge. If you do that and then another season, you're going to be measured by that. That's the ambition. I'm sure David Simon isn't worried about my opinion about it, first of all. But I think that's the measure. You set the bar by which you're measured. And I think to do anything less, you would have rejected that too. So I feel okay about bringing the highest expectations to that season. And I think it was a failure on that level.
This book changed me as a television watcher because I came into it as a diehard fan of almost every one of these showrunners that you highlighted. And I came out of it with a little bit less respect for most of them, but also a greater respect for the writers and the producers that they surrounded themselves with, and just how damn hard it is to make these television shows.
That makes me extremely happy. I'm glad to hear you say that, because that's the idea. I tried to uphold the mythology of the all-powerful showrunner while trying to give a sense of all the other moving parts and all the things that have to go right and all the hard work that goes into it. And you're right. Vince Gilligan said to me, the worst television show you ever saw was horribly hard to make. And so doing a good one is even more insane. And some of them come off better than others. I don't think it's any mystery which ones I'd prefer to work for if I had to. But it's worth saying that they all get to the same place, which is shows that we should just be incredibly happy to have had the opportunity to live through the period when we could watch them.
Out of the shows you cover, which one's your favorite?
As much as my book spends a huge amount of time drawing lots of points of connect between them, they each stand as completely different projects. They've got enormously, wildly different ambitions, and I'm very happy to live in a world in which I don't have to choose. I think The Wire is mandatory viewing. But even Breaking Bad and Mad Men are different in what they're trying to accomplish.
Today, you tweeted, "A great drama is a mixed blessing, but a good sitcom is a joy forever." I thought that was interesting. What did you mean?
I meant I was watching, because a bunch of these network sitcoms that I enjoy very much came back on last night, and it was just such a joy not to have to live through the hell of the dramas. You know what I mean? When you start watching one of these things, there's a moment now when the intense weariness of what you're going to have to live through and how bad things are going to get comes over you, at least me. And it's tempered by the exhilaration of all the things that come with watching good art and all the kind of like higher level pleasures. But it's also a curse in some ways to have to live through these emotional maelstroms and know that things are going to go very badly before they get better. If they get better, there's no guarantee anymore that things are going to get better. Whereas a simple, comfortable, funny, well-crafted half hour serves another kind of TV function. It's the different muscle, and I want to sit down and watch a moderately good sitcom sometimes is exactly the drug I want.
I just figured you were promoting your sequel to your book, which will be about comedy.
No, actually, I have another book in the works, and it's about the rise of celebrity chefs and the transformation of the job of chef. It's not a direct sequel, but it is conceptually the same. It's another group of mostly men who lived through a creative revolution in their job in which power drastically shifted into their hands. And so it'll be following a handful of chefs from New York, and that'll be out in a couple of years.
Great. That sounds interesting. The final question we have is, we want you to pull out your crystal ball and you tell us that after this third age of television is over, what's next? What's next for TV as the commercial model splinters and choice becomes rampant and creativity is on an iPhone? What's next?
I don't have the answer, obviously. My cause for hope is that, unlike other golden ages which have shut because the powers that be reasserted their control, our current media age promises chaos for a long time to come. And that is one of the elements of the secret sauce that keeps creativity going. I think you see it on Netflix or you see it on Hulu for the same sorts of reasons that HBO decided that they needed to invest in crew talent in order to make themselves stand out from the pack. Those conditions still exist. It probably won't happen on those networks, but there's so many channels that sooner or later somebody is going to figure out that their only way forward is to throw up their hands and say, all right, here's an incredibly talented lunatic. Let's give him the division of General Motors.
Great. Brett Martin, you've written one of my favorite books on television I've ever read. I would recommend all of our listeners go out and get it. It's Difficult Men, available in, you have audiobook too?
There's an audiobook out there, yep.
All different formats, whatever you like to read. Highly recommended by the Red Room Podcast. And thank you for your time today.
Oh, thank you guys so much. I'm really glad we got to do it.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Great interview with Brett Martin.
Yeah, he was very gracious to meet with us and give us some insight into the must-read for anyone who loves television.
Yeah, I mean, it was funny because I initially picked that book up on the cover. Tony Soprano's on the cover, and it says Difficult Men. So I assumed that the book was about the characters in these shows and maybe a cultural examination of them. That wasn't what it was about at all. It was much more interesting.
And I've been a scholar of television even before I could really focus on it. So what I liked about the book is that it starts way before The Sopranos. Now, like any good book, it jumps you in right at the height of The Sopranos and you get hooked with it. But then it really rolls back to Stephen Bochco, who was someone who mattered to me, Doogie Howser, NYPD Blue, Murder One. He even goes back to Rockford Files. I loved Rockford Files.
It shows you that television is an art form that's been evolving for 70 years. It puts you at a place and time where we are as this medium of artistic expression and commercial model of selling art and where it is in its development.
The primary character of this book is David Chase. And we didn't talk about this in the interview, mostly because I didn't want to put Brett in a position where he has to speak out against someone he's interviewed and obviously has a relationship with, because he did write some of the behind-the-scenes things for HBO. I don't view David Chase in the way that everyone else does. I actually am not a fan of The Sopranos. While I can see that it changed television, I don't believe David Chase changed television. I would say James Gandolfini might have changed television, and maybe somebody would argue with me, but what did you think of the character in the book of David Chase?
He was one of the ones I talked about that came out with much less respect. You talk about the story alone that he fired the guy who co-wrote the episode that won them the Emmy the night the Emmys aired and they won the thing, and he calls the guy up and fires him. I just lost a lot of respect for the guy as a person. I couldn't imagine working for somebody like that.
And we talked about I'll Fly Away, which he said he was a showrunner on, and I disagreed with Brett that the show was as great as maybe people think it was, but he said across the studio hallway was Northern Exposure, and David Chase in the book consistently bitches about Northern Exposure, says it's a piece of crap show, and then takes over the showrunner. Yeah, I'm not going to respect you because I feel that Northern Exposure is a piece of crap. You wouldn't step over there. I didn't come away with David Chase as the end-all, be-all. I think he was a money-grubbing person who hated television, hated himself, and in my opinion, hates the people who love him as well, and created a show to trick the average American into thinking they were watching something better than they were. And if you didn't think that before, Breaking Bad really had to prove it. Because here, you see what a great show does that uses consequences.
All of these guys trained within this writer's rooms, and they produced amazing writing. One person he didn't talk about was Chris Carter. I would say he was probably a difficult man to work with. I get that impression. Produced Vince Gilligan. So the secondary people that have come out of this creative revolution are really the ones that have inherited the bulk of this ownership.
If you're sitting at home and you love The Sopranos and you want to argue with me, my guess is your argument's going to be, hey, you can't go back and watch The Sopranos now and compare it to what's here because that's not fair. It was the pioneer. And I will turn around to you and say, hey, today I can watch The Godfather. I don't sit there and watch The Godfather and have to say, oh, remember, this was made 40 years ago. And the same with Twin Peaks. You put Twin Peaks on today, it's still there. We're watching China Beach. It's still there.
Doesn't hold up as a story. Movie, television shows have gotten beautiful. There's no doubt about it. They're gorgeous. But you go back and watch are still gorgeous,
and they still
and they scare the crap out of you. They're amazing.
So it is perfectly fine for me to judge The Sopranos at a 2013 level. And I don't think it stands up, mostly because Tony gets away with absolutely everything. And I do feel in the book that they really lay things at David Chase's feet. I don't buy it.
You can't deny from a commercial perspective, it absolutely was the genesis of all of the opportunities that these other showrunners had. There would be no Mad Men without The Sopranos because they actually sold the concept of the show from the executive producer of The Sopranos. So that was the big thing that they used to sell audiences. So from a commercial perspective, I can accept that. Now, what I really liked about Brett's book and his concept was he tied all these shows together from an artistic perspective underneath the surface. That idea of this collective unconscious of the artist and of the human race, as we struggle to fight against what the bankers were doing to our world before we even realized what was happening. We had Tony Soprano there, who was out there just doing whatever he wanted to do and got no consequences for it whatsoever. People, their lives were ruined because of the choices he made. Same with Walter White. And we saw this played out in our own lives 5-6 years later when the mortgage crisis happened, and we had somewhat of a frame of reference from an artistic perspective.
And I think there is a divide where I would say there is the David Chase school, which is I'm going to come up with a scenario that's really awful, and Tony going to get it. He's going to get it. Guess what? He doesn't. Everything's fine. Everything's back to normal. Then on the other side, if you take The Wire and you take everything they do comes back to haunt them, it might be 2, 3, 4, 5 seasons later. For me, I want choices to matter. And that's the kind of television that I would rather watch. Another thing that we wanted to discuss is a statement. No one could respect The West Wing and The Sopranos.
Yes.
Because he said Aaron Sorkin writes every character with an eloquence that isn't true, and he thought the same about David Milch as well. What's your opinion on that, Steve?
In some ways, I agree with him, but that's the reason I like those shows. To tune in to see a show that's with the way they would react. Jed Bartlett in The West Wing is the president we absolutely want. We want the man who stands up on principle and gives a speech and quotes the Bible at the same time he quotes Shakespeare and is morally just and right. Those are the characters that we're telling stories about. And same with Deadwood. You know, Al Swearingen giving a blowjob soliloquy, beautiful moment of poetic art. And I think it would be cheapened if we threw Paulie Walnuts into that same situation.
I believe that David Chase, in his hatred for anyone else's art, doesn't realize that there's a similarity between The West Wing and Deadwood, and it's called an analogy. Or, as we've said, a fairy tale. We've said many times that The West Wing is a grown-up fairy tale. Now, you could argue that The Newsroom is why Aaron Sorkin is suffering, because The Newsroom is not a fairy tale. And maybe Aaron Sorkin doesn't excel in writing characters.
Newsroom should have been a fairy tale. That's a great formula to have. Give people the fairy tale that they're not getting in normal life. Give me the newsroom that operates the way that it should operate. That was the original premise of the show. Beginning of the pilot, the credits and all that, they showed Edward R. Murrow, and that went away in the second season. That's not there anymore. I think he abandoned the original precept of the show. I don't know why, and it's a shame.
I thought that was an interesting part. For you, what part of the book really?
The David Milch part. So I love David Milch as an artist. I agree with Brett. He's never finished it. As a television producer, he's probably not the most successful. But the way he approaches his art is very much the way a creative writer or a literary novelist would. I think that he is one of the true artists in the medium of television that's pushing beyond the boundaries of what any commercial art form should ever allow him to do.
Yeah, they tell a story about Deadwood being canceled. And HBO says to David Milch, we want you to do only 8 episodes. And he says, I'll think about it. And at the same time, an actor calls and says, I'm going to buy a house out there. And he says, well, don't do it because I don't know if it's coming back. And then he tells his agent, who tells the press. So HBO said, we better cancel it. I found that story to be extremely unbelievable. We've seen with Community that when a network wants a show to and they could care less who's coming back.
There's also probably the time that HBO started to self-destruct and opened up the opportunity for channels like AMC to take up that reign. If you look at what's happened on HBO since then, it's a debacle.
My guess is that AMC splitting Mad Men seasons is AMC's demise. It will be the end of them as well.
It's expensive to produce these shows, so if I were a corporate spokesman for them, I would say we have to put this in a place where the revenue model is going to generate enough to cover the cost. From a fan's perspective, that's not we want this stuff for free, I would fund it. I'll throw $10 in on a Kickstarter to help Mad Men get a whole season in if that's what it takes. I'm willing to put my money where my mouth is.
I feel that they've made their money, and I think it really is awful. It's really ransom. Believed in them. Here's an idea: create another show that's good. When I was a kid, it was Cosby, Family Tie, and Night Court. And then they could never do that again. They gave you The Single Guy or Caroline in the City between them friends because they were blackmailing. And now AMC is doing it. So guess what?
It's a business, and eventually the commercial piece will suck the life out of the art. That was one of the takeaways I had from the book. But also, the inner machinations of how the writer's room worked in these shows was fascinating to me.
There's a great bonus feature on the 3rd season of the Blu-ray of Star Trek The Next Generation that focuses on Star Trek's writer's room. And it was very similar to this. Michael Piller made people really map out. Ronald Moore gets up and they have a board in there and he writes it out. So by the time you were writing it, you had this outline that was amazing. And I thought it was interesting.
Those are writers we love, Ronald D. Moore, so why not go to the source?
I would suggest all our readers pick up this. I didn't get to tell Brett, but I do say that this was the first electronic book I ever bought. I want to keep it forever. I'm paying to download this, so I actually bought it, and that's a big deal. I have little rituals when I watch things. I do watch Twin Peaks. I always watch the Saturday Night Live. I think this will be part of my watching, so by all means, buy it. And thanks, Brett, for joining us.